people don't really believe that the money has run out until they see the evidence in the most brutal way. Labour government could make changes now that would be much more painless than waiting until the crash. We need to undo all of the Blair-Brown constitutional reforms, including getting rid of the Supreme Court. Trump is much more of a mixed bag, and his arguments are bizarrely poor, even from a protectionist point of view. A professor of Mandarin could be suspended because he used a Chinese phrase that sounded a bit like the N-word, to crowds cheering straight-arm salutes at CPAC.
If you had the Prime Minister sitting in front of you, what would you advocate for? Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, and today I'm joined by a man who needs no introduction, though I will give him one regardless. Lord Hannan is a newspaper columnist and the president of the Institute for Free Trade, as well as a working Conservative peer in the House of Lords. Welcome.
Thank you, Callum.
I'd like to start off with a very simple question, but one that I think we should be laying out wherever possible as free marketeers, classical liberals, libertarians, however you might say it. Why do you believe in freedom?
Because I learned it. And I think this is a really, really important point. I was not born a free marketeer, and I bet neither were you, and I bet neither was anybody watching, right? Tony Abbott likes to say conservatism is lived, not learned. And I think that's true. But it is not true of classical liberalism, a lot of whose precepts are counterintuitive. We don't tumble to them generally. We need somebody to show us the way. I remember a particularly key moment, actually. It was my first term as an undergraduate. And the person who led me to the stage of enlightenment that I was after was Mark Reckless, who went on to become a Conservative and then a UKIP MP. He was studying economics, I was studying history, and I had tossed out airily the idea that tariffs were a jolly good idea because instead of taxing people and depreciating economic activity at home, we could get foreign firms to pay for things. And he explained why this wasn't the case. And then he went on to show me the basic David Ricardo argument for comparative advantage, the way it's taught in standard economic theory with wine and wool, the examples he gave. And I remember reading it through and thinking, this just can't be true. This can't be true. I can see how free trade works for the more competitive country, but how can it possibly work for the country that is being outcompeted? And I read it through a couple of times and I thought, oh, logically, this must be true. This is like a bit of maths. Wow. And a light bulb went on. And I think it's a point I can't stress too often. The ideas that we put forward, for example, that rent controls actually drive rents up, or that you can cut tax rates but get more revenue in, or indeed the whole basic idea that an economy allowed to arrange itself higgledy-piggledy will work better than one planned by all the brightest people. All of these ideas are counterintuitive. All of them need to be taught. And I think that's the vital work that an organisation like IEA does. Indeed,
and a great journey then from tariff proponent to president of the Institute for Free Trade.
Yeah, I mean, look, but I think all of us, if you like, are tariff proponents when we're born because we have the caveman instincts that make us want to be self-sufficient. And human beings often lead with their guts and then reason backwards. If you do that, which most people do, you remain a tariff proponent, which is why there is always a market, whether for the Corbyn variety or for the Trumpy variety, of support for self-harming policies, because it seems to make sense. It stands to reason. A few of us look into it, and I hope that people listening to this podcast will look into it if they haven't already. I'm guessing most of them will have done it, which is why they're listening. But it's the looking into it and the seeing that protectionism always makes you poorer, that it doesn't protect, it destroys, that it does more harm to you than it does to the people it's targeted at. It's reading the evidence and seeing that, or equivalent things about the Laffer curve or whatever, that make policy, if you like, rational and objective rather than intuitive and wrong.
Exactly, and we will come on to trade shortly. But first, I'd like to look at the sort of domestic political setting that we have at the moment. What hope is there for people who believe in freedom and economic freedom with the current government and the current economic situation that we're in? What do you look at that is happening that fills with positivity and the reverse?
It's very hard to be optimistic. But if we'd been having this conversation in 1975, 1976, we'd have been equally pessimistic. We would have seen a Tory government that was too weak to overcome the vested interests that were holding up growth, followed by a Labour government that actively embraced all of those interests. We would not have known in 1975, 1976 that we were on the cusp of a national renaissance. Now, what changed, what galvanized that renaissance was the total collapse and the IMF bailout of 1976. And I have a feeling that something similar will be needed before we move to any kind of reforms now.
And do you think it will come?
Oh, without doubt. Markets are going to notice that there is no plan to get our budget back into balance. The basic problem in Britain, as in Western Europe, is that we've gone during this century from the state being about a third of our GDP to the state being closer to half of our GDP. And, it's the difference between two people carrying a third, grabbing him by his wrists and ankles. You can just about manage that. You can make some progress. It's not as fast as it could be, but you can keep it up for quite a while. And one person carrying another. It's the difference between 1/3 and half of the GDP. One person on your shoulders, you're really not going to go very far. Now, in theory, a Labour government could make changes now that would be much more painless than waiting until the crash. They particularly could reform healthcare. They have permission to do that from the electorate in a way that the Tories don't. They could probably reform pensions, raise the state pension age, end the triple lock. They wouldn't be losing as many votes as the Tories would. They wouldn't have their entire kind of association execs in arms against every MP voting. They could certainly reform welfare more easily than us. And, of course, they can reform planning. They don't represent the entire green belt. I had hoped that there'd be some of that when they took over. I can't see any evidence of it at all. And indeed, the reforms of the kind of mental health sick note system that Mel Stride had put in place and that were interrupted by the early election appear now to have been shelved following an adverse court case. So I really don't see any readiness from ministers to make, as opposed to talking about, tough decisions. And I think, therefore, the markets are going to force it on us.
So, but what about the planning reform? So the government are making lots of good noises about it, about taking on the NIMBYs and saying no to the blockers, etc., and they've said they've given support to the third runway at Heathrow, etc. Is that not reason to be optimistic?
Well, why are the anti-runway people at Heathrow taking that in their stride so calmly? Why has there not been an angry backlash? I think we all know the answer, because the anti-runway people at Heathrow know that the courts are going to block this, in the same way that the courts blocked the expansion of the Rosebank oil field off Shetland. If Labour or any government is serious about getting stuff built, they need to tackle the judicial activism, the whole process of judicial review, and the eco-targets that we've inherited from the EU and in many cases built upon. Otherwise, all you need to do to stop any development is to say this is going to impact our carbon emissions in some way, as they will in Heathrow. So I'm afraid we've got to the point where the third runway at Heathrow is the sort of totemic thing that a chancellor who wants to sound as though they're pro-growth dashes out in a panic. Serious growth, in terms of planning reform, means restoring the supremacy of the government over the courts and prioritising economic growth over EU environmental standards or domestic environmental standards. And I don't, again, see any sign that this government of human rights lawyers, this government of Doughty Street and Matrix Chambers is prepared to do any of that.
So a problem then is a more structural one than just who's in charge, although who in charge matters as to whether they're going to take on those structural challenges. Is this the problem is this the same problem that we've had for the past however many decades? Yeah.
Since Blair, yes, the problem is that it is the easiest thing in the world to say, I'm going to stop people absconding from prison, or we're going to control our borders, or we're going to make our regulators focus more on competition, or whatever it is. I mean, anyone can say those things. Until we return power from the standing functionariat to the elected representatives, until we restore purpose and meaning to the act of casting a vote, none of it matters. It doesn't matter how you vote, because the blob runs the country. We change only the outward-facing bits of the government, the public-facing bits, the people we see on TV, but the decision makers remain the same. And they are as wedded as they always were to Euro-corporatism, to eco-corporatism, and to safetyism, which are the things that prevent growth.
And so how do we take that on? What is the magic solution?
Well, I think it isn't a magic solution. It's a lot of hard graft. We need to fix the plumbing before we do anything else. We need to make sure that the next right of centre government is able to implement the manifesto on which it was elected. In order to do that, you need to change the rules so that ministers can bring in their own people, either from within the civil service or from outside. We need to undo all of the Blair-Brown constitutional reforms, including getting rid of the Supreme Court. We need to scrap all of the laws behind which our courts are hiding when they prevent growth-friendly policies from happening, whether it's the Equality Act, the Human Rights Act, the Climate Change Act. Get rid of all of that. And we need to go back further and tackle the basis of judicial review within our system, which goes back, it really got going, I suppose, in the 80s. Doing all of that is going to require a battle with the establishment, with the standing apparat, that will make Brexit look like a picnic. They will fight tooth and nail, and it will consume the energies of a government for at least one parliamentary term. And I really hope people understand the magnitude of what's required. I do get a little bit frustrated when I listen to particularly some of my reform friends saying, oh, it's so easy. What do you just do? Why don't you just send the immigrants back? Why don't we just get rid of woke? Why don't we just cut spending? Of course, they're right. We should do all of that. But pretending that it's going to be easy, ignoring the extent to which the leftist nomenclature will dig in defense of their privileges and their ideology, I think does a disservice to the electorate.
Is this in a way carrying on from the logic of Brexit and actually saying, well, look, we've separated from one structural institution that clearly wasn't working for us and was stopping us doing the things we want to do, pro-growth wise especially. Now we need to take that logic and not only make the most of that decision, take the Brexit freedoms that we have, but then apply it to domestic problems as well.
Absolutely. During the Brexit referendum, one of the stock phrases that I used on a lot of speeches and interviews was that there was no point in taking power back from Brussels only to leave it in Whitehall, that Brexit should be a beginning, not an end, a beginning of a process of pushing powers downwards and outwards to local government, or better yet, to individual citizens. That has not happened. In almost every field, we have taken power back from the European Commission and we've given it directly to unelected British regulators without any intervening democratic phase.
So it's not even been taken back by British ministers. It's been outsourced to regulators, commissions.
It's been outsourced to safetyist, anti-growth regulators who, at the very least, have not improved things and in some cases have made matters worse. We had a really horrible early sign of this when we took back control of our financial services regulatory system. Our first use of it, our first use of our Brexit freedom, was to require a higher capital holding from banks than had been the case in the EU. We've done similar things when it comes to eco targets and phasing out of engines and so on. We've done, our first use of our VAT freedom has been to become the only country, with the very partial exception of New Zealand, the only country in the developed world that doesn't treat education as a public good, but that sees it as something to be taxed. So unless we are prepared to use the freedoms that we had and that we've recovered from the EU to stimulate growth, to set policies in our own interests, then we're going to end up with all of the disadvantages of EU membership, but without the market access that we had as the price for it.
And do you think that, to my mind, and I think to a lot of people's minds, the narrative at least is setting in now that actually there are serious structural problems with the UK? I don't know if it's about the fact that we've gone from a Conservative government to a Labour government and things haven't just fixed immediately. And people are starting to wake up to bigger problems. Do you think we are now approaching a point whereby the difficulty of those decisions that you suggested it would take an entire parliament to get all of this done, that will be an entire parliament not doing other things? Now, as you say, well, Brexit was quite a painful experience for everybody. That it would be that, but tenfold. Are we now ready, or will we soon be ready as a sort of populace? That will the voters be ready for? Are they sort of irritated enough to be ready for?
When I said earlier that we needed a 1976 style, we probably will need a 1976 style collapse. I don't say that with any relish. It's a horrible prospect, right? I'm a taxpayer. I'm a father. I'm a British citizen. I would much rather avoid the crisis. But looking at how politics works, not only here but in every advanced democracy, I think you need people don't really believe that the money has run out until they see the evidence in the most brutal way. It is possible to make cuts and to return closer to where we were. When we had 1/3 of state spending as 1/3 of our GDP as state spending, that was under Blair, right? It wasn't under Thatcher, right? It's just going back to the Blair spending levels when Gordon Brown was Chancellor would solve 80% of our problems, right? So it could be done, but I don't see it happening until there is a crisis. I think of the case of Ireland after the Euro crisis. Ireland, surely the most culturally and politically compatible country to ours in Europe. Ireland made genuine cuts in 2011 and 2012, proper, serious reductions, not what the left means by cuts, which is a smaller than scheduled increase or a reduction in the rate of increase. But everyone from the Taoiseach to the recipients of unemployment benefit took an actual cut. There were limits on unemployment benefit. There were pension cuts. Public sector workers were laid off. The ones who kept their jobs had pay cuts and pension cuts. Ireland since 2013 has grown more impressively than almost any country in the developed world. In fact, if you look at the raw GDP figures, it has been the biggest success story in the world. But even if you strip out the statistical effect of having a large number of US tech giants headquartered there and, if you like, artificially bolstering the GDP, the growth has still been way above anything in Europe or Britain. And you can do that, but look at what they needed to jolt them into it. Now, the problem for Labour is that the parties that deliver these cuts are never thanked for the subsequent growth. So Fianna Fáil, which was in Bertie Cowan, was the Taoiseach when the cuts happened. Fianna Fáil had won, in the sense of getting more votes than any other party, every election in the Republic since 1932 up until then. Right? They then went from 42% to 17% at the next election, and they have never recovered that previous position. Same thing happened to PASOK in Greece at the same moment for the same reason. They were the party that had to initiate the cuts program there. So I can see from the Labour Party's perspective why they don't want to do it. But the answer is to, if they were only able to think, would be to start making more moderate savings now rather than waiting for the crisis. And if they look at centre-left parties in the rest of the Anglosphere rather than at Europe, there is actually a much more successful record there. Roger Douglas in New Zealand, Paul Martin in Canada, arguably Bill Clinton in the US, Paul Keating even in Australia, centre-left leaders who started economic reforms in time to avoid the crisis and the electoral annihilation that followed if you leave it until too late.
That all makes a lot of sense. And side point about the growth in Ireland, I guess, what you say, the bringing in the American tech firms, that's not necessarily something that we should be carving out because they came because of the low operation tax rate.
Don't get me wrong. Those US tech firms are then paying a huge chunk of Ireland's tax bill and are creating jobs there, right? I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all.
No, but they're there because, or partly because of the corporation tax rates.
Yes, and it was very telling that when Ireland faced the crisis, when they faced the Euro crisis, they did not succumb to the temptation of whacking up corporation tax. They knew that would be the end of their growth and that they instead looked for savings. Now, I don't see any of that thinking from Rachel Reeves. I think her instinct is always to grab more tax rather than to cut things. But heaven knows there are plenty of things that could be quite easily cut.
So on the topic of cuts, is there internationally that we might argue that there's actually a bit of a groundswell for almost demand for cuts? You see, look at what Malay's doing in Argentina and what Trump and Musk are doing in America, for example. What do you make of those projects? And do you think that that cuts to an overswelled public sector and government will actually be popular?
They are never popular until after they've happened. So Milei is a good example of how you need a collapse before you're ready for this. I know me. I think I'm the first British politician to have met Millet. I got to know him. I won't say before he was cool. He was always quite cool, but before he was famous, because I remember when he was first elected as the only MP for the Libertarian Party, and I liked his style, and I speak Spanish. I could follow his speeches, and I made contact with him, and everyone was writing him off as a lunatic at that time. But he could see then that Argentina was out of options. And it's very much to his credit and to Argentina's credit that such is the liberty movement in Argentina, not least because organizations like the IEA have been promoting ideas with like-minded young people in Argentina, that he's retained public support to an extraordinary degree, even while cutting pensions and so on. That there are enough people out there who get what he's doing and why, who don't think that there's a magic money tree. Terrifically in favor of what Millet is doing. I wish he had dollarized earlier. I think that's his one big mistake, because that would have been a lock against a future Peronist or socialist government undoing what he's doing. But other than that, terrific. In terms of Doge, I think that the Trump is much more of a mixed bag. Of course, the domestic deregulation and tax cuts are great, and I hope they happen. I mean, so far it's been promised rather than delivered, but if anyone can do it, Elon Musk can. That sits very, very oddly with what he's doing in international trade, and his arguments are bizarrely poor, even from a protectionist point of view. I mean, he simultaneously talks, when he's talking about tariffs on Mexico or China or Canada, he wavers between this will bring in revenue, this will force the other side to back down, and this will repatriate industry. Now, in my view, all of those arguments are wrong, but they're also obviously incompatible with one another. If one of them is true, the other two, by definition, can't be. And it's terribly depressing to see everyone nodding along. And people who know better, economists who know better, pretending to see that there's some clever 3D chess here when they know perfectly well that there isn't. Such is the coercive power of MAGA, the unwillingness of people to stand against it. But really, Callum, something has gone badly wrong, hasn't it, when the US is siding with Putin and against Denmark and Canada? I mean, how do you pick a fight with Denmark and Canada? They're two of the most implausible baddies in the world, the Danes and the Canadians. To have convinced a chunk of the American electorate that these are evil, exploitative countries and that America needs to give them a good slapping. I tell you what, looking at that reaction, I have a much clearer understanding now of how authoritarian regimes get going historically.
I completely agree. But is there Trump's defenders would say there is a game of 4D chess going on here. It's maybe not even necessarily just with the trade element, but with the geopolitics of it. Just to dip into that briefly, the outcome will be peace in Ukraine or whatever it is. I mean, do you have any hope that there's any of that going on?
Well, one of the bizarre things is that all the way through Trump's first term, people would try and project their own preferences onto him. And it never works, and it always ends badly for the people who do that. He doesn't have any ideology. And to be fair to the guy, he doesn't pretend to have. He sells himself as somebody who trusts his instincts and who is unbound by dogma. And yet everyone, including the Bannonite natcons, who have tried to fix him ideologically in place where they want, has ended up losing. So we're seeing the repeat of that process now. Within hours of his appalling comments about Zelensky being a dictator and Ukraine having started the war and all this, I had a bunch of American kind of traditional neocon or Reaganite foreign policy people saying, this is actually a brilliant bit of 4D chess where he's pivoting to take on the Chinese and he's detaching Putin from China and the Chinese are the real threat. I mean, giving Putin a win is really not going to bother the Chinese. It's extraordinary that you can't see that. And then equally, a bunch of my libertarian friends saying, oh, no, this is all just about retrenching and ending these forever wars, and it's a clever way of doing it. I mean, when are you going to just take the guy at his word? He has not liked Zelensky ever since he tried to coerce Zelensky into that business about Hunter Biden and all that. It's that old adage that I did him a bad turn years ago and I've borne him a grudge ever since. Because Zelensky, through no fault of his own, had this cameo role in the Trump impeachment, MAGA have had it in for him ever since. And I'm no particular fan of Zelensky. I wouldn't have voted for the guy. I think he's made huge unforced errors in terms of his domestic policy. But the idea that Ukraine started the war, the idea that, the Ukraine waited until 100,000 Russian troops were massed on its borders in February 2022 and then picked that moment to start a war, and the willingness of these people to go along with it and to shout down any opposition is really quite scary.
Is it, have classical liberals or liberals with a small L sense, if you like, have we lost the argument on free trade? We might look at Doge and think, well, that's good, but there isn't, as you lay out, there isn't necessarily much else to be optimistic about. Have we lost the argument?
Yes, I think we are losing the argument. You began, Callum, by asking me when I became a free marketeer. And I replied that it was basically a kind of education, right? We read our way into this. It's one of those creeds we have to read our way into, unlike some. We've stopped teaching freedom. And I don't mean by that we're not teaching kind of Austrian economics. We never really did much of that, at least not officially. It fell to private initiatives like this think tank to do that. I mean, we're not teaching the basic Enlightenment virtues that sustain an open society. We're not teaching the counterintuitive but important idea that people that we don't like might still have something interesting to tell us. We're not teaching the idea that truth, rather than being handed down by some political or sacerdotal authority, or being whatever Trump or your favorite guy says that morning, is an objective reality that can be reached through a process of interrogation and debate and trial, and that we can change our opinions as we go through that process. We've, in other words, stopped teaching empiricism. We've stopped teaching the Enlightenment, and we've gone back to teaching, in the guise of identity politics, these pre-Enlightenment ideas that, the most important thing about you is that you're white or female or whatever, that the world is a hierarchy of privilege. It's funny. It's called postmodernism. This idea that the truth is a function of who's saying it. The student revolutionaries in the 68 risings in France, the 68 would say, "Where are you speaking from? D'où parles-tu, camarade? D'où parles-tu?" Right? In other words, what you're saying is not intrinsically true or untrue. It depends whether you're black or white or where in the imagined pyramid you are. Right? That is how most pre-modern societies thought, right? Under the guise of postmodernism, we've reverted to pre-modernism. And this is now not only in our universities, it's in our secondary schools, even in our primary schools. And so that's why we've moved so quickly away from the ideal that the individual should be above the collective to two competing forms of collectivism, the identity politics of the left and the natcon trumpery of the right. Konstantin Kisin talks about it as replacing the woke left with the woke right, characterized by the same sense of grievance, the same collectivism, the same identity politics, and the same willingness to make truth contingent on convenience.
So the vibe shift has been from one bad vibe to another.
Yes, and it's happened with astonishing rapidity. We've gone almost overnight from a world where a professor of Mandarin could be suspended because he used a Chinese phrase that sounded a bit like the N-word, to crowds cheering straight-arm salutes at CPAC. The rapidity of the revolution has left even the agents of it reeling. It's not just the firing of all the DEI hangers-on and rent-seekers. It's that we've gone from mandatory unisex bathrooms to it's suddenly okay to talk about whether Rishi Sunak as a brown Hindu is English. And what's been left behind in all of this is the idea that over the last 200 years raised the human race to a pinnacle of wealth and happiness that was previously unimaginable, i.e. the foregrounding of the individual. We've, if you like, we've kept the collectivism of the woke, but we've just switched the labels around. We've switched around who are the goodies and the baddies. But the fundamental problem is still there. And it was the problem that I think was beautifully enunciated by Thomas Sowell. I can't put it better than he did. That you can't maintain an open democracy on the basis that two babies born on the same day arrive in this world with a set of pre-existing grievances.
So what hope is there for people who believe in the primacy of the individual going forward? What hope is there for them in the UK, in America, internationally, for people that believe in those Enlightenment ideas?
Well, I think we have to go back to first principles. And I'm going to tell you, this being the IEA podcast, I'm going to tell you a story that was told me by your founder shortly before he died, Ralph Harris. This is going back 20 years. He told me about the collapse of the classical liberal movement in Europe, and in Britain particularly, as a result of the Second World War. It's a little bit like what we've seen through COVID, only 6 years of it, right? Freedom had been crushed under the treads of the tanks, right? We'd been through mobilization, conscription, rationing, mass nationalization, all of the things that wartime economies go through. But we'd been through it for so long that people had forgotten what was wrong with that. They began to see it as the normal state of affairs rather than as an emergency. And politically, that resulted in the crushing of the old Liberal Party, which at that time was still a classically Liberal Party. They went down, I think, to 3 or 4 MPs in the 50 and 51 elections. And that, by the way, was a fair reflection of their vote at that time. They were getting, something like 3% of the vote or less. So Ralph and the remaining classical liberals faced this dilemma. What do we do now? We've apparently lost everything. We have, on the one hand, a Labour Party that is nationalising anything that moves. On the other, a Tory party that is militaristic, colonialist, patrician, paternalistic, and mildly protectionist. What is left for us? Now, there were, as Ralph tells it, there were lots of people who said we keep the purity of the idea. We behave like those Irish monks in the Dark Ages at the edge of the civilized world, copying out the holy texts and keeping civilization alive for a moment when the sunshine returns. But Ralph said, look, I don't want to waste my life doing that. I don't want to spend the rest of my days reading papers at the Mont Pelerin Society. We've got to actually actualize these ideas. We've got to turn them into policy. So if there is no Liberal Party, let's take the less bad of the two big parties and let's start educating individual MPs. And they started with the people who were elected in 51, Nick Ridley, Enoch Powell, Geoffrey Howe. And their big breakthrough was Keith Joseph, who of course turned into Margaret Thatcher's John the Baptist. So they went in one generation from starting with nothing to having the party leadership, because they were focused on whom to educate and how, giving them the right books to read, bringing them into this building and exposing them to the kinds of ideas that once you've seen, you can't unsee. But Ralph was very clear that there was still something contingent about this, that Margaret Thatcher was never particularly popular with the non-libertarian mass of conservatives. I would liken this, borrowing Jonathan Haidt's metaphor, to a rider on the back of an elephant. Margaret Thatcher and the small number of people around her who saw the value of market reforms, they were the mahout, right? The elephant was the mass of the conservative movement, driven by its own instincts, perfectly good instincts, but instincts, not ideologies. Religious faith, patriotism, suspicion of excessively rapid social change. Now you can steer the beast. You can whisper in its great ear. You can tickle it and nudge it a little bit, right? But only up to a point. What you can't do is slide down its flank and start jabbing your goad into it. That is not going to end well for you. And in the end, with that alliance, with that Liberal-Conservative alliance, the mahout and the elephant, we achieved immense things. But it was still, as Ralph had always predicted, it was contingent. He had always said the party will turn on her the moment she stops winning. And of course, in November 1990, that's precisely what happened. Now, it seems to me we are at a moment now when if you like, the elephant is now rogue, is trampling around wild. There is no pro-Enlightenment classical liberal mahout on its back. And the question for us is, how do we, if you like, go back to that Thatcher-Reagan alliance? Can we rebuild that partnership, or do we risk being trampled? And at the moment, it's looking very like the second.
Do you then? I'm interested in the sort of harmony between classical liberals and others on the political spectrum, if you like, and where the bonds and the relationships and the alliances are made. Do you see a path through the past 14 years of Conservative government is criticised for not being particularly classical liberal in a lot of senses, and there's some good stuff and some wins, but on the whole, the size of the state grew, and taxes weren't really cut that much. Regulations grew. The problems that you talked about earlier with the judiciary, etc., weren't tackled. And is there a path through now, with the right alliances, whatever they might look like, to a sort of a better future?
Well, I hope so. The problem of this blob control of this powerful and immobilist standing apparat is that a lot of people, after 14 years of Conservative government, blame their problems and blame our country's problems on what they imagine to be free market policies, which of course there weren't any, or very precious few. So it's become a commonplace to say capitalism means that, and then fill in your whatever gripe about your life, house prices or inflation or tax rises or whatever. A country where 45% of all economic activity is controlled by the government is not a free market country, right? It's extraordinary that needs saying, and yet it obviously does. So we're in the worst of all worlds, where we've had very statist policies, but people imagine that they are suffering from Thatcherite policies. What's the way back? Well, assuming that we can forge the kind of structural changes that I was talking about earlier and implement things, nothing succeeds like success. Every one of Margaret Thatcher's policies was unpopular before it happened. I can't think of an exception to that. Every privatization, every deregulation, even the lifting of exchange control, even the tax cuts were unpopular when polled in isolation. But of course, the effects of those policies was anything but unpopular. She was triumphantly re-elected again and again. And we need to put ourselves in a position where we can get stuff done so that people will judge us on the results. Now, for what it's worth, I think that will require some kind of unite the right movement. Both the Conservative Party and the Reform Party have a floor beyond which they are not going to sink. And to have a constructive majority in Parliament and be able to do these things, they will need to reach some kind of accommodation, I think. And next election may be a long time away, lots of things can happen. But we should not make decisions now in either party on things like candidate selection that would preclude an eventual entente of some sort. And when I say entente of some sort, I'm not talking about a merger. I'm just talking about a grown-up acknowledgement that parties should be prepared to stand down selectively in seats where they cannot win, but where the other one can. The difference between doing that and not doing that is the difference between some kind of minority Labour government and the beginning of the transformation that we're talking about.
And just to take it back to what we've already touched on, I guess there's also a requirement and a need to sell freedom again, to basically reteach those principles through whatever communication means possible and necessary, to say, actually, yes, these policies that we are suggesting, they may be painful, but they will turn out well in the long run. You pointed out that they are always unpopular when you first explain them. So to get over that bridge to win the election, someone who believes in these ideas is going to have to explain why we should be putting the individual first.
And I think I'm talking to that someone. It is the role of organisations like this to do that. When people say, why doesn't the Conservative Party ... fill in whatever their particular bugbear is, I think that misunderstands what a political party is capable of doing. Anything a politician says is assumed to be tendentious. It's assumed to be self-interested and partial. So it is too much to expect a political party simultaneously to make the argument for something and to position itself as the beneficiary of winning that argument. A political party needs around it a much wider ecosystem of people prepared to make the case. Now, think tanks like this, I think, are a critical part of that coalition, but they're not alone. I think you need also to have interest groups, sectional groups within professions and within parts of society that are prepared to make the argument. So if you want to have a reform of the NHS or a return to, which we're going to need by the end of this government, the kind of Blair Gove approach to a knowledge-based education system, no one's going to believe a Tory politician arguing for those things. You need to have, as it were, doctors for reform or teachers for a knowledge-based curriculum. You need to identify the people who have those views within the profession who know about it, but you then want to keep them at arm's length from either the Conservative Party or the Reform Party. You want to make sure that they are taken at their own estimate as concerned citizens within those fields. And I think that applies across the range, whether it's the Countryside Alliance or whether you're going to have consumers groups lobbying on energy prices or whatever it is. The right is not going to win until it has what the left has always had on its side, which is this whole coalition of kind of charities and NGOs who are taken as neutral and are accepted as impartial by the public. And that's why I think the work of the IEA and its allied think tanks is absolutely critical.
Obviously, I agree.
No, a great interview. Before
we wrap up, I'd like to ask one sort of slightly silly but I think important question, which is if you had the Prime Minister sitting in front of you, the Chancellor sitting in front of you, the Cabinet, and you could sort of dictate one policy to them that would bring economic dynamism back to Britain, what would you advocate for?
A Singaporean-style healthcare system where individuals are given healthcare accounts, transferable accounts, and where both the providers and the consumers are given an incentive not to waste money. So for those who don't know about it, actually most of Asia has a variant of this. Singapore happens to be the one that I'm familiar with, or most familiar with. You are required by Singaporean law to pay a certain proportion of your income into a dedicated healthcare account. That's then your property. You can spend it on yourself, but you can also spend it on behalf of somebody else. You can pay for your children. You can bequeath it in a will. It's yours. Once you have topped it up to a certain level, you're no longer required to pay into it. So Singaporean consumers have every incentive to shop around and find cost-effective treatment. And therefore, doctors have every incentive to offer cost-effective treatment. But the really key thing is this. Only a small part of that fund is insurance. This is where it's very different from what happens in Europe. The Singaporeans have clocked that most healthcare needs are not really insurance because they are predictable. Right? You don't insure a car against needing to fill it with petrol. There are some running costs that you take as read. So getting your teeth checked, getting your a sprained muscle fixed, care during and after pregnancy, these are not, as it were, insurable illnesses. These are just conditions that you should pay for out of day-to-day spending. The insurance component is for unforeseeable catastrophic illnesses that you suddenly get multiple sclerosis or something, and that's not something that you'd normally be able to pay for. So the result of this is that the providers know that you are paying rather than an insurance company paying, and they are incentivized to price accordingly. I had a flood in my flat not long ago, and the very first thing that the builder said when he came in to assess the damage was, "Insurance job, this is it, Governor?" Right, and how much he quoted was depending on that. Now, of course, doctors put it a little bit more politely than that, but they've got exactly the same incentive in Europe or in the US. In Singapore, the physician is encouraged to compete on price, and therefore encouraged to behave like a businessman. If he stays open at weekends, he can retire earlier, right? And the result of all this, and I just think this is unarguable, Singaporeans have the biggest increase in longevity over the last few decades. They live on any metric better than we do, more healthily than we do. Poor Singaporeans are much better looked after by that system than poor Brits are by the NHS. So if there was one thing, only one, I've got a long list, it would be that. And I think the Labour Party could get away with doing that in a way that the Conservative Party couldn't.
Fantastic. So we'll ping this to Wes Streeting as soon as we're finished.
Well, I don't see much evidence that he's prepared to do it, sadly. But I see that Alan Milburn is back, and he might just, you never know, because he felt that the Blair reforms were truncated midstream and that it's unfinished business. So let's see. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed indeed. Daniel, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you too for listening. As always, you can find more from the IEA at our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. And until next time, thank you very much.